Adding a non-volatile solute to a solvent increases the solution's osmotic pressure. So what we're saying is this: the more solute you add to a solvent, the higher the solution's osmotic pressure. Or more concentrated in terms of solute gives a higher osmotic pressure. Now, we haven't talked about osmotic pressure yet, but just know that a dilute solution, a dilute salt solution, say, has a relatively low osmotic pressure. A concentrated salt solution has a much higher osmotic pressure. So let's define osmosis. Osmosis is the net movement of solvent away from a solution with a lower solute concentration toward a solution with a higher solute concentration. Another way to say this is that osmosis is the diffusion of a solvent, i.e. from an area of higher solvent concentration to an area of lower solvent concentration through a semi-permeable membrane. Osmosis means the movement of a solvent away from dilute solutions and towards concentrated solutions. When you were in school in a biology class, you might have used some dialysis tubing with various sugar solutions and found that depending on what type of solution you had inside the tubing compared to outside, the tubing would essentially maintain its shape or would take water in such that it would have a very tight dialysis tubing or would have a net loss of water. That is all related to osmosis. Osmotic pressure is symbolized by lowercase Greek pi, and osmotic pressure is the external pressure that would be required to prevent osmosis. Let's see if we can get our minds around this a little bit. In the upper right here, we have a vessel that has in the middle a semi-permeable membrane. And on the left side, we have simply a solvent, say water. And on the right side, we have a mixture, say water and salt. And on the top here, that's colored with hatching, we can imagine some kind of rubber seal that we could push on or we could pull on if we wanted in order to affect certain changes in the system. With this semi-permeable membrane and having only pure solvent on the left and a mixture on the right, solvent is going to tend to flow from the more dilute solution to the more concentrated solution. So it's going to flow to the right. What that will do is that will cause this rubber seal to go up as the volume on the right side increases. If I push down with a certain pressure, I can prevent the flow of solvent from the left to the right. The harder I have to push down in order to prevent solvent from flowing to the right, the higher the osmotic pressure of this solution be. A solution's osmotic pressure, pi, can be thought of as a negative pressure. That is, the greater a solution's osmotic pressure, the greater is the tendency for solvent to flow into the solution. So again, in the upper right, I've signified that solution B has a certain osmotic pressure, and the greater that osmotic pressure is, the greater is the tendency for solvent to flow into it. Here we have something that has a very small osmotic pressure, pi. There is a tendency for solvent to flow towards that solution, but not a great tendency. On the other hand, if we have a solution with a much higher osmotic pressure, that is a much larger pi, there is a much larger tendency for solvent to flow into it. This would be analogous to very salty water, and pure water, that is the solvent, would tend to flow into that mixture. So let's define these terms. Hypertonic solutions have large osmotic pressures. They are concentrated in terms of solute. Hypertonic solutions would be very salty water. Hypotonic solutions have a smaller osmotic pressure. They're relatively dilute in terms of solute. Only kinda salty water. If we look at these red blood cells, on the left, the medium, that is what's on the outside of the red blood cell, and what's on the inside have the same osmotic pressure, and so the red blood cell maintains its standard shape. What's happened in the middle picture is that solvent, that is water, has escaped from the red blood cell. Which part of this system, inside the cell or outside the cell, must be saltier? Outside, that is the medium. So the medium would be a hypertonic medium. Here, the medium is hypotonic compared to what's inside the cell. Water is flowing into the cell. There's a net flow of water into the cell, and so the cell gets very, very large. So one more time, let's tackle this. In between here we have a semi-permeable membrane. The left side is very concentrated, let's say in salt. Doesn't have to be salt, could be sugar or any solute, but I'm just using salt as an example. The left is very concentrated in salt, the right is very dilute. Relative to each other, the left side is hypertonic, the right side is hypotonic. Another way we could think of this is that the left side is dilute in water, and the right side is concentrated in water. If we look at it that way, which way will water tend to flow? Well, water is going to tend to flow from areas of higher water concentration to areas of lower water concentration, which means there's going to be a net flow to the left. Would there be a tendency for salt to migrate to the right? A net flow of salt to the right? And the answer is yes, but the semi-permeable membrane does not allow the passage of salt. It does allow the passage of water. Reverse osmosis is the process of applying a pressure greater than the osmotic pressure, such that solvent is forced to flow against its will, you might say, from low solvent concentration to higher solvent concentration. Reverse osmosis is sometimes used in the desalination of seawater. So if you look at this picture in the lower left, you can see here in the middle this purple semi-permeable membrane, and what we're doing here is this salt water on the left has a certain osmotic pressure. There is a tendency for fresh water to flow to the left into there, and reverse osmosis means that we are applying a pressure from the top here that is greater than the osmotic pressure of the saltwater solution, and we're forcing the solvent, namely the water, to go through that semi-permeable membrane, and we can thus desalinate seawater.